Welcome to TechPoutine.
The band is back together. Really happy that Eleanor, you're back after mat leave. So I guess first official episode back with Eleanor. Gabriel, Ian and I had to struggle without you, as you probably saw or listened to. It was very difficult to get a guest. So we're very happy that you're back, Eleanor.
Definitely the quality went down when Eleonore wasn't here.
I was gonna say, actually, you guys did a lot of pretty cool things, like in-person podcast, room full, I heard. So, but I'm really glad to be back.
Maybe it's a good first subject. How was mat leave? I want to tie it into obviously like how the industry could do better for moms, but I'd like to hear how it went. How did you enjoy like now being a mom? How's little Maxence doing?
Thanks. He's doing great. He's just at the age where if you don't look at him at all times, he's probably gonna kill himself in different ways every 3 minutes, which keeps me on my toes. But no, things are great. I really enjoyed the last year. I'm really glad to be a mom. And to your point, I think I spent a lot of time also in the past year thinking about how this industry, the venture capital industry, with the startup reality as well, can somehow do better to support new parents in their role. And I think I'm super passionate about building a new generation in VC in Quebec and supporting new founders. And it's super tough to do that while becoming a mother. And I think we're pretty lucky in Canada when you compare ourselves in terms of like, government programs and so on. But there's so much more than the money into making a successful mat leave. And I was really lucky. The folks at Brightspark were in a Brightspark baby boom, so I was not the first one to go. But I think I would stay away from giving too many advice to expecting mothers and young mothers. I think that's sometimes, especially people from older generation, like definitely mean, but it doesn't come out as the best way, or it comes out as things you should be doing or shouldn't be doing.
I know more about that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna name names.
No, not names, but an example of
But
bad
just
advice.
when you're planning for your mat leave and people assume, oh, I heard both. Oh, you're taking less than 12 months, and you hear judgment or like, really listen to me like you're gonna want to take 12 months, and you're like, no, dude, like you don't know how I will. I don't know how I will feel, so you definitely do not know as well. Or the other way around, where people are like, oh. You like people see me as this workaholic girl. You took 9 months. That's really impressive. And it's just, it all comes from a good place, but it's tricky.
Yeah, it's definitely a personal journey for everyone. So there's not one right answer. I was talking with Marco this morning from First Capital about that. Everyone has their own advice, but really you got to feel it out yourself with your partner.
We did also one live episode. Check out episode 8 of TechPoutine with your partner Sophie, and she spoke up a lot about the challenges at the structural level of how LPs approach VC. I won't go into specifics because she was very open and candid, so people could listen to it. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it was very disheartening to hear that, hey, like we haven't evolved as much as an industry. Yeah, props to you for coming back and being like bearing the flag and saying we can do better.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, yeah, as an industry, there's a few folks like for example, fellow board members, other investors, like especially males that really pick up the slack while I was away. Like Isaac Swain, big shout out at Frontier Ventures. Like he filled in spots on HR and finance audit committee on the board. And I think if you want to support people inside or outside your organization, of really like taking the time to ask, how do you see your leave? What can I do to help? And really keep the seat warm and make the person have to worry about less about little things, and making sure that you just help out and roll up your sleeve and do the extra work where the person is very busy at home with a newborn. I think that just goes such a long way.
Maybe a good time to dive into the laundry list of topics we've been saving up, Eleanor, for your return. Want to talk about early stage. There's a lot of ink being spilled about the state of early stage, that somehow it's like maybe a cause for concern. But then, of course, there's great bright spots, great companies being funded. I'd kick it to you. We were talking about it before recording, Eleanor. Like, what's your take on early stage / seed stage today?
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like when we look at our deal flow at Brightspark, like the past few quarters, like Quebec has always been like our strongest market inside Canada. And it has decreases a lot in terms of the number of opportunities and number of like quality opportunities we're seeing on the venture side. And then at the same time, I keep seeing folks like claiming there's not enough seed capital. Like what we know for sure, the facts is that there's not enough seed companies being funded. But I'm really questioning whether there's just not that many people building new companies or being at that stage, or is it really a lack of capital problem?
Why do you think there's fewer companies, what is it?
That's I spend a lot of my time actually
I would think so, yeah.
thinking about this.
Yeah.
But one thing we were discussing is maybe there's just not, because there's not a lot of liquidity exits in the market. There's just not that many successful people who've been through a full cycle and are now out of their job. They got their earned out, their option paid, like ready to build something new. I think it might be a delay because of that. And at the same time, we have some great companies who are still great places to work at, like Shopify. We were also mentioning a bit earlier, like a lot of the early Shopify folks are still at Shopify because they're still building an amazing company and having a great time, which is amazing for them. But we'd love to see maybe more of them just starting something from scratch and looking for capital.
It's definitely interesting. I feel like it's a tale of two stories almost, because I hear both sides of this conversation. And so I've heard from several people in the venture industry that there's not a lot of opportunities. But I guess what I'm hearing as an entrepreneur, as a founder on the ground from people in our networks is there's not a lot of investors that are taking risks in Canada and in Montreal. And what might not be talked about often enough is a lot of the founders that I know that are raising or starting companies are leaving Canada. And so I know several founders.
More than ever?
Yeah, more than ever.
Really?
Yeah, more than ever.
For what reason? For capital?
For capital, for mindset, for risk appetite, for just being closer to the action. It feels like there's a kind of pull again to San Francisco for a lot of people. And several serial entrepreneurs that I know, they're thinking about raising in the US, they're thinking about moving to the US. And so I think it's flipped back to that. There's several founders that I know who have exited their companies and are thinking about what's next. And in many ways, they're skipping the Canadian seed rounds and they're going straight to the US. And I think that's the difference between...
But they're going straight to the US to raise capital or to move there?
To both.
Really?
Yeah, both. And the whole capital gains thing, that was like a big fire, was it, 6 months ago or 4 months ago? That was like the straw that broke the camel's back. A lot of people use that as the last straw to move. And so the difference I find today between entrepreneurs versus in 2008 or like the beginnings of the ecosystem in Montreal is there's way more connective tissue between Montreal founders and US investors. And so a lot of people have relationships in the US and can go straight to the US. And I can see both sides. I think there probably is truth that there's not enough opportunities in Montreal, but I also think that some investors might not be seeing the companies because they're going to the States directly. So
I love that expression, not everything that counts can be counted and everything that be counted counts. And to your point, like I've seen a lot of this anecdotal evidence of founders leaving or just deciding to start directly in the US. And in the corollary to that, a lot of the founders that are staying, it's a badge of honor if you're getting a term sheet from a US VC, which by and large, it can end up being much more competitive and sometimes maybe even better for the founders. With present company here excluded, I would say there's some very good few VC funds, but not enough. We're trying to raise, and like our pitch is 2/3 of Series A checks are being led by the US. And now it's even more common to see seed rounds being led as well. So it's a big question, right? Eleonore, you mentioned like it's a hot topic as to the why and like how we can go against the current. I think part of it is just that it's a competitive market, right? If they're great companies, they're going to attract attention from elsewhere. Like we participated in the Max's round. They did a Series A in May. They had 9 term sheets, 6 were from the US. It ended up being a Canadian consortium, but like the good companies have no problem getting interest from down south.
I have a question for the entrepreneur, for you, not because you guys are looking at the market very closely. When was the last seed round that you heard of in Canada?
The last seed round that I heard of in Canada, I can't even think of the last
I can't
one.
either. I'm sitting here trying to think about it. I can't think of it. I know a lot of founders trying.
Yeah.
Very few succeeding.
I
don't remember of any succeeding.
I know a lot of founders trying. I'm helping several of them try. And from their perspective, the market just feels closed in Canada. The other thing, just as a data point, we were looking at the last batch of YC companies that I think it was the spring 24 batch. And the number of companies from Montreal specifically was like incredibly, I think there was only one, if anything. compared to the companies from Ontario or other parts of Canada, there's way more. So I think it's a Canadian problem, but it's even more acute in Montreal or in Quebec.
So how about the same question to you now? Like, what's you as the seed stage investor? Which one? What's the most recent one that?
The most recent, I wouldn't be able to say. One that comes to mind is Reliant AI, pretty big seed round with Inovia participating, like
Yeah.
bold idea AI company. I think there's definitely a few, but I really hear your point, Gabe, about risk appetite. I think one of our biggest flaws in the industry in early stages, especially in Quebec, is if you want to do a seed with 1 million ARR and a repeat team, then no, that company is a US Series A. Like you're not in the right market. Like people need to be able to come in pre-revenue, sometimes pre-product, and you need to fund companies. You don't go far right now with a $1 million Canadian seed round. Like you don't want to overfund companies as well. But if you want to play and compete on a global scale, to be a leader in your market, not just the best Canadian company doing ABC. You need the proper funds to compete. You need the funds and the mindsets, which I think right now sometimes we lack on both sides.
How does that? I talked about this word that I learned in the last couple of years, profitability. Right? I hadn't heard about this until recently. Like, how does that push towards profitability influence fundraising? Like in my mind, it probably it's positive for the companies that are in the market, but a challenging one for those who are not yet.
I can go, but I'd be really curious to hear Nectar on this, especially since you're focusing more on Series A. I think at the early stage, it's probably a mistake to even talk about profitability. You want, in our portfolio, past Series A, B, once you get like a certain level of revenue, you want to see a path towards profitability in case you cannot raise. And on the growth stage for IPO markets, we've seen even local companies like going public very early in terms of revenue with no clear paths to profitability. That's another discussion. But on the early stage, if you're talking about profitability at the seed stage, that's probably an issue.
I think the way I would tackle the answer to this, or at least give some perspective, is not necessarily talking about that particular issue, because I think that's downstream from what's happening. And even on our end, we're going to be focusing a little bit more than pre-A as well, because there's just not enough deals happening at the Series A. So like we're rejigging our own portfolio construction. So then the question becomes is like, why are the graduation rates so low? Why aren't there enough companies to your point in Eleonore? I think that's the more important question rather than the market pulls out. Like for great companies, like you mentioned, Reliant, right? Like great founders, I'm one of them, and there's no profits here. It's like the business and economics of it. If you're raising a seed, like no one cares. It's like they're just pitching this crazy idea, this huge white space. And yeah, Inovia, I think, led the round. So it's like a Canadian VC. So I think the real debate is, okay, is it a cultural issue or is it more supply and demand? There's just not enough maybe capital dollars here versus the US, let's say, that there's a lot more VC dollars.
I think the reality is there's less capital in the market, right? With the interest rates going down and the capital flow that's happening in the market, there's less dollars. I think what entrepreneurs need to be aware of is we've reset from 2021, where you could think about raising a pre-seed round with an idea or maybe an MVP. In today's market, I'm hearing from entrepreneurs, most investors that they're talking to, maybe they haven't spoken to Brightspark, are saying, come back when you have 50K in MRR for a pre-seed round. And so that's completely flipped from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, people used to think, let me raise a pre-seed round so I can build my MVP. And now it's like, you have to have an MVP, you have to have MRR
and traction.
Right.
You need to have everything.
And so a lot of entrepreneurs are asking like, how can I do that without capital? And so we've gotten back to the world where you need to use your savings. You need to raise money from friends and family. You need to do all of these things that wasn't necessary 2 years ago.
And at the other extreme, there's a company who raised $6.6 billion. See, I went there. I went there with $5 billion in loss.
I'll just have one point on the market dynamics. So yes, there's been a market pull down. We're not in the crazy days of 21, 22, but at the same time, I'm not sure that's all that bad. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Red Queen effect, right? The more faster you run, you're staying in the same place. With the nature of software today, you can go much further than you can 10 years ago. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to say, hey, where is your MVP per se? Particularly if it's the first time you're doing this and you don't have, let's say, a proven track record. I think it's healthy for a company to not have free money. And So, of course, like this is a general rule, but I don't think it's a bad thing for a company to be able to show some kind of traction. It doesn't need to be revenue, could be just adoption, etc. I think it's going to make for healthier, better businesses overall. And then we're always going down this track of VC, etc. But it's like you should build a business for you first, and not for an investor or someone outside. So yeah, like not every company should get VC dollars. Ideally,
Yeah.
build it for you, your family, and for your heritage first. And then if it's a big global idea, then well, that's a different conversation.
Yeah. Maybe to just speak for the entrepreneurs that are probably listening, I think what's challenging is when we hear that, I think a lot of people are thinking, but yes, I have to pay for my mortgage. I have to pay for food for my children. How am I going to build my MVP without any capital? And so there's this chasm that people now have to cross. That's a reality that people are facing. That's challenging for them because the market doesn't appreciate or back entrepreneurs at an earlier stage now.
Okay, so Ian went there. We could talk about maybe talk about OpenAI's recent raise. We're to debating. I was like, oh, there's so much ink being spilled about this topic, but at the same time, it is the largest like fundraise, I think, VC fundraise of all time. The quick numbers, they raised something like 5.7 billion, 6.6 billion, thank you, on $157 billion valuation, 5 billion revenues.
3.6 billion in revenue, 5 billion in losses.
Yeah. So at the same time, fastest company to hit like 100 million users, fastest company to hit $1 billion in recurring revenue. I'd like to get your perspectives, but I also want to tie, what does this mean for Canada? Like, and I don't say that flippingly because we have a lot of AI companies here and a lot of AI talent. So what does this mean for Canada? But Eleanor, I'd like to maybe kick it to you.
Yeah, I think we're now at a scale of the large companies being so large, like in just the traditional tech giants. Like we've been in that world now for a few years where you're like, who will replace these companies? It's very hard to think of a startup starting now that will win this battle against the incumbents. And when you see companies like OpenAI raising that kind of money, be like reaching that kind of scale so fast, you're like, how as a local founder or a local investor want to participate in this market, how can I play a role that is like even worth talking about when you see that kind of scale and that kind of cash going towards these like very concentrated company? And we have had a few of our own AI companies in the past, and we are now seeing a new wave in Canada. But I really wonder, can we compete for that kind of company? And maybe not. Maybe we're not going to be building the models and the large LLMs ourselves. And maybe we don't really have a play in the chip infrastructure. Maybe we do. But like, where can we play as Canada to have an actual cool end goal and build something that can be a global leader in the AI market? I wish I had an answer, but it's something I always speak with other investors and other founders and try to figure out.
I really find it interesting the way you talk about, we've had these mega big tech companies around for quite some time, 10 plus years, whatever the number is. And all of a sudden these guys come out of left field and all of a sudden reach that scale so quickly. I'm like, what the fuck do you do with $6.6 billion? But at the same time, it's incredible what they've achieved in such a short amount of time.
You buy a lot of NVIDIA chips is what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what it feels like is, unfortunately, it looks like Montreal is going to miss the boat in terms of working on some of the foundational models. And when you compare it to the movement that happened with the internet, there were a lot of really great companies that were created that built the backbone of it. But there were also a lot of great companies that built services on top of the internet. And so I don't think we have a company in Montreal. Canada, we have Cohere is probably the closest one that's building a foundational model. But I still think there's a lot of opportunities to build services on top of the foundational models. Some people call them frontier models or very customized models on top of the core foundational models. I think that's still up for grab. And I think that's probably the most realistic place that Montreal startups will have to play, which is in some ways, personally, I find disappointing because we do have a lot of very talented AI researchers in Montreal. And so it would feel like it would have been possible to compete on the foundational model side.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the point where we talk about what happened with Element AI. And we had that one chance a few years ago, but did it come to fruition? there's a lot of different like branches go down, like the cost of compute, where the joke back in the days, like 80% of VC dollars go back to Google and Facebook to fund customer acquisition. Now it's like 80% of the dollars are going to NVIDIA to fund compute. I find that's interesting. Is that going to be, I'd love to hear, Eleanor, you're probably seeing you're closer to it. But the question I think that you bring up, Gabriel, is what's the opportunity here today, knowing that maybe foundational models, like we don't have enough capital to make it happen here. So where therein lies, what is the opportunity here?
Yeah, one interesting thing that's being discussed, and I don't know a lot about it in detail, is people are now starting to talk about the access to power or to energy. And so Canada and Quebec has a potential interesting role that they can play on that front. And so if power becomes the constraint to really scale these models, and it's not about the chips, but it's because of it's related to the power, then maybe with Hydro-Quebec and all of the clean energy that we have and new companies like Deep Sky that are coming up to just play in that space in general. I know they're not generating power, but interesting things happening. So that might be interesting. I've read something that I think Microsoft just purchased a nuclear power plant, and you probably know the details, Nectar.
I'll say one quick point. So like two things. One, a lot of the big tech are negotiating directly with the energy utilities out of the US. I was having a chat with this really smart guy, and he was telling me how there's going to be, in the coming years, there's going to be a lot more power blackouts. But the one thing that won't get shut down is all the AI services, because they're going to pay 17 cents the kilowatt hour versus 5 cents that goes into the grid, because it's like your Microsoft or your Google, and you just pay upfront, right? So like basically for profit. Another interesting piece, you mentioned Quebec, but there's an article this week how the Minister of Energy of Alberta is talking to all the big tech for their natural gas to try and get exactly the same thing. In fact, take advantage of all this power-hungry AI.
Just side note on Alberta, like everyone talks about Alberta these days. I think the government invested a lot of money and did a lot of programs to build the tech ecosystem there. And I think it's starting to pay off. Like it's one place to watch, I think, in Canada. But I think on your point, Gabe, like we have a lot of the talent, we have a lot of the resources here, I think, but all these huge companies, like you need a crazy visionary person leading, telling the story, convincing all stakeholders to build something really massive here. And we do have a few of those visionaries in Canada, but I'm eager to see one really step up in either AI or in energy. I think those are two super critical verticals right now where we need to build leadership as a community.
One of those leaders is, I think, a person like Fred, right, from Hopper. And we're to go back to the topic of like Montreal startups ecosystem, what's going on. Obviously, the news with Lightspeed this week that they're considering go private. I'm anxious to see, let's say, the next step with Hopper, because you need the next generation of big exits to fuel the next generation of angels, the next generation of founders, and maybe we can convince a few people from Shopify to quit to start their own thing, or Harley's going to hate us. But yeah, like, what do you guys think about like that whole generational cycle of like company gets started, founders exit, then either become investors like my partner Fred, or start the next thing or invest into a few companies?
What's the exact question?
That whole cycle, like how do we accelerate that cycle of exits to companies being formed?
I don't know exactly how to accelerate it, but one of the cycles that I went through was with PasswordBox, right? And after the acquisition of PasswordBox by Intel, I started a company. Greg Whiteside started a company. Marc-Antoine Ross started a company, right? Two of those have exited now. But like that, there was 3 companies within a year that came out of that. And now it wasn't the multi-billion-dollar exit, but it was a successful exit on all counts. And there's been, and after our exit, there's been 2 companies that have been started, one of which Gabriel knows very well. But I think, I don't know that it takes, the bigger the exit, obviously, the higher the likelihood there will be multiple companies founded. But I think pretty much every exit I can think of in recent times has generated new companies.
Yeah, I would say so. We just haven't had the volume, I think, that we need. But PasswordBox is a great example. I think you can tie back a lot of great companies that have spun out of kind of the PasswordBox executive team or even non-executive team. But also several of the people from PasswordBox have invested in other startups, including Dan Robichaud, Daniel Bichot invested in Notman House as well. And so you did see that ripple effect that happened from the success of Password Box. But Password Box was what, 7 years ago?
2014.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, how do we have more of these successes? And I think when you look at ecosystems like Toronto or Ottawa, even, the impact of Shopify's success seems to be much more clear. We just haven't seen a lot of it. We see small signs of it, but just not enough of these successful companies that are creating this ripple effect that you see in the Valley.
I think one point that people might disagree with, but I think we need to have more ambition, but also fail faster. Where like again, just looking at some data points of my inbox being on mat leave and looking at all the inbound emails, like there's some companies like that are been trying to raise that round and find product market fit for 4 years, and they survive with shred and a bit of cash here
Zombie
and there.
companies.
But maybe just and they're great entrepreneurs. It's not about nothing against the people. Maybe like the idea is not worth pursuing. Kill it and go back to the drawing board, find something new to do. I think that would help also with just the velocity in our ecosystem.
I think that part of it is the culture there. Like,
Yeah.
I won't name the company, but I invested in one company. It's been 12 years. They're chugging along. Revenue's been flat. It's like, I think it's a detriment to the founders that they don't shut it down. He's like, how many shots on goal you're going to have in your
Yeah.
career as an investor? You invest a bunch of companies, but as a founder, you only have a few. So it's like, they should have probably shut it down and taken that IP and tried something else versus like shred credits, all these financing mechanisms that keeps them going. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that point. We need to have a little bit of that more cold, hard medicine sometimes.
Yeah. It's a conversation I have often with entrepreneurs. And the feedback that I get is, again, tying back to this risk appetite that we have in Canada. In Canada, unfortunately, and maybe even more so in Quebec, people see a failed startup as a sign of failure, like end of point failure, compared to the US, where if you failed, an investor is more likely to back you because they know that you've learned, you made some mistakes, you know what to do better next time. But in Canada, it feels like you're marked forever as a failure and people won't touch you again. And so maybe that's in the minds of the entrepreneurs, but it feels like that's a consensus that people tend to stay away from those founders.
I cannot agree more. I think to add context around my comment, like I think it comes a lot from responsibility from investors, not founders. Also, like we're in the business of making sometimes great money, but also losing money. And I think it is part of the ecosystem here sometimes that writing off an investment is seen as like such a big deal versus no, it's part of the game. And again, it does not say anything about the quality of the founders, like actually being able to, and as a board, recognize that we're not going in the right direction or we're going to a path to nowhere. Let's see what we can do to save everyone like precious years and you know how taxing it can be to be a founder and a CEO. Maybe we use that brain power towards something that has more potential. And it is a big responsibility from the VCs, not just the founders, to make those decisions.
I think it speaks a little bit to the maturity of the investor community in Canada. I think there are some investors that get it. It sounds like Brightspark gets it. But I feel that there's just a missing connection that failure is really a stepping stone in many ways for a lot of entrepreneurs. And the likelihood of them being successful going forward is higher. And the reality, I think, as we know, as entrepreneurs and hopefully as investors, a lot of the time, the success and the kind of outlier success of a company doesn't have anything to do with the founders or the team or the product. It's just market timing. And things can change so dramatically. You've told me great stories about timing related to some of the businesses you've worked on in the past or invested in. But you can do everything right. But if you're not at the right place at the right time, you just won't have that hockey stick type of outcome.
And it's so interesting because I completely agree on this notion that founders think that if they fail with a startup, that it's like they're done, they're written off, like they'll never get anything else. By the same token, how many times have I spoken to a founder and words like, I'm a first-time founder, as that being like a negative. So I'm like, so don't see it as a negative, right? Just go for it. And if you fail, you've learned and you start again. But there's this thing of, oh, I'm a first time founder. I don't know how to do this. Just eliminate that from your language. And then if you do fail, now you're just contradicting each other by saying, I'm a first time founder, but if I fail, I'm never going to have a second shot. So it's just a weird dynamic.
Yeah, I think you all know that I lived in the US for almost 7 years, and Ian, you were in the States as well. In the States, in some ways, saying that you've had a bankruptcy as an entrepreneur is a badge of honor. And it just shows that
Because you gave it all you got.
you gave it all you got.
Right.
You were out in the arena, you were trying, and you weren't successful. But then you go back, and here it's like if you have a bankruptcy, you're marked for dead. And so timing is such a big factor. You want to talk a little bit about your startup in the Valley in terms of timing for you guys?
Sure, happy to do that. It was 2006, and we built the very first picture sharing app on the planet way before Instagram. It was before AWS. It was before the iPhone. And it was a very challenging time because people didn't even know how to share a picture. But we went around the world telling people that one day we'd take pictures with our phone and share with our friends in real time, and we'd have conversations around these moments, these snapshots of our life. Some people thought it was we were crazy, but our seed round was led by Reid Hoffman, and our A round was led by Jeffrey Moore at MDV, and our Series B was led by TFJ, especially at that time, very known investors. But the iPhone came around, and by the time the iPhone came around, we had started migrating to the cloud. And to put things in perspective, people would go to our website on their phone and we'd detect which device it was. And if we had an app for them, we would offer them an app, a J2ME app. But we had 250 versions of our app.
Yeah.
Because every phone was different.
Yeah.
There's no democratization.
Yeah.
So imagine building out a new feature, what it meant to deploy to 250 different apps. So when iPhone came around, it was one phone, one device.
Yeah.
Far more advanced than everyone else.
Better camera, better screen.
An 8 lens, right?
Yeah.
Basically,
So you basically built Instagram, but maybe 2-3 years too early.
Yeah.
I remember, I think you showed me a picture of someone who was taking a picture of their meal and sharing it with someone else. And that was a thing on Instagram that they were doing on your product way before Instagram.
Yeah. Taking pictures of your boarding pass before boarding the plane. So like your mother or your significant other would know which flight you're on. We used to call it visual conversation. Perfect idea, right? Exact right idea, right? But bad timing. Bad timing.
Oh, yeah. One of the partners at Bright Spark says it's very easy to build a successful timing. You just need the right culture, timing, and luck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It speaks to, I think, a little bit the generation difference, right, of building tech companies. Like even Ontario, like there may be 1 or 2 turns at the wheel more than here in Quebec, right, with the Nortails and the Rims. And if you look at the Valley, they're on their 12th generation of building and exiting tech companies. So I think part of it is that in terms of understanding the formula. Why do the French have the best wine? Like they've just been doing it for way longer. So I think part of it is we're just earlier in the journey, at least in Quebec, versus some of our peers. But I don't think it means that we can't punch above our weight. We're talking about it over lunch, how we have like insane talent here, like particularly AI talent, which makes me super optimistic and hopeful for the future. We spoke about Reliant, I think is one of those examples of this really cool, innovative technology. I think there's just maybe some catalyzing effect that's missing to a certain extent to propel it. But their ingredients are there. Imagine being in like some other country. I'm like, thank God we're here where we have all these smart people.
But bringing many different topics of today together, like I feel when I came back to Montreal in 2010, and it was the beginning of the tech community, I feel like Montreal was ahead of Toronto, right? And Toronto has definitely surpassed us. And here we are today saying we're behind and there's no founders. So what the fuck happened? Like we lost our edge somehow because we were working together at that time at Real. And I feel like there was a lot more startup activity here than there was in Ontario. There was big tech perhaps, but like startup sort of seed stage, it was happening here. And now we let them eat our lunch.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's the elephant in the room for some people in some conversations. Definitely Real Ventures not being in the ecosystem today has left a gap There are some seed funds that have stepped up, but Real was very active back in the 2009, 2010 period. And yeah, I think that's just a reality is there's less investors in many ways.
One thing I'll add, maybe some of you saw on LinkedIn and Twitter, we on X, we hosted the Kaufman Fellows Summit in Montreal. First time the Kaufman Fellows Summit came to Canada. That's an event that regroups hundreds and hundreds of top tier VCs from everywhere around the world. And one of the conversation people kept having after listening to panels and so on about the Canadian tech ecosystem was in Canada, especially in Quebec, how much we're so lucky to have so many governmental institutions backing the ecosystem. And it's true, like we are so lucky in terms of the number of LPs that are also doing direct investment from Quebec, from IQ, all the way to participating in Series C, D, E rounds. Like there's a lot of governmental capital going to our ecosystem. So going back to my point, I think maybe it's not fuel exactly in the right vehicles to it's the pre-seed, early seed market, but there's a lot of capital here and there's a lot of talent. So there's definitely comes to what is the missing ingredient right now to put this all together because we have so much of what it takes to be like a killer ecosystem. And maybe it's just a timing question. Ecosystem go through ups and down. Maybe we're just gonna down and as soon as upper goes public, then might change. Who knows? But
I think I know what we should do. I think we got to call Brad Feld and have him move to Montreal and do what he does.
Build a community.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, great conversation. Maybe I want to, maybe last kind of like item on the conversation is
That was the first topic. No, I think.
you mentioned Eleonore Kaufman Fellows, and like
Yeah.
I had a lot of FOMO following on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm like, oh my God, I wish I could sneak through a window and see what's going on. So maybe start with what is Kaufman Fellows for people that don't know, and then talk about this past event. It seemed like you had you got a great lineup of speakers and content.
So Kaufman Fellows is a non-for-profit that was started over 30 years ago to be a training house networking platform for venture capitalists. And obviously, you don't think about the industry 30 years ago was very different than what it is today. The idea was to get very promising future investors all together in a program, get them to bond together, be super vulnerable with each other, and really build like long-term relationship. Now, I think Kaufman just announced earlier this year, like class 29 of the Kaufman Fellow program. It's a 2-year program. I'm in court right now. I'm class 28. So is Mia from Inovia doing growth here in Montreal as well. And every year, the Kaufman community, so all alumni together, are invited to a Kaufman Fellow Summit, which, last year was in Nairobi. Next year is going to be in London. And we're super pleased to have, thanks to the BDC partly, convinced the team to come to Canada and they picked Montreal as the place to host the Canadian Summit. And it made me proud as an ecosystem. Put some of our best entrepreneurs on stage, explain to the world our ecosystem works, like what opportunities we have here. And AI, climate were two of the main topics. I think, what we have in terms of natural resources and a lot of the hard problems the world is facing. We have a lot of maybe not the answers, but at least path to answers in Canada. So people were really excited. Like a ton of people didn't know Shopify was Canadian. So I think there's just a lot of we have to do a lot still to raise the profile of Canada on the global scale. But it was really, and the weather was perfect. I'm not sure if people will invest more in Canada. That will take a few years, but people will come back to Montreal, that's for sure. And a ton of people tried poutine, said it was pretty good.
Nice. I think there were like 200 VCs. 600 VCs were roaming around Montreal. So entrepreneurs, you missed an opportunity.
A lot of Patagonia jackets.
A lot of Patagonia. You could have hung around downtown and looked for the crowd of Patagonia jackets.
Yeah, it was perfect
weather for it. So I was trying to figure out the location because I'm fundraising. So I was going to try to sneak in as well. But I didn't get the intel.
Maybe Gabriel, for you, talk to us a little bit about upcoming events. There's a few coming up now in Q4.
Yeah, pretty excited. We're having the Startup Community Awards. That's going to happen at the end of November 28th, which is always a fun event. You should find that on LinkedIn. I think they're in the process of nominations right now. So a lot of great people will be participating in that.
If you're on LinkedIn and you haven't seen it yet, like you're not paying attention.
Yes.
So much of it right now. It's like, oh my God, another nominee.
Yeah. And then another exciting announcement connected to the Startup Community Awards. Ian and I and a group of other community folks, including Alistair Kroll, David Dufresne, Phil Tellio. I think that's the crew. Yeah, that's the crew. Connor Clark has helped as well in the past, have been organizing Tech Noel, which is the annual holiday party for the tech community. And so this year we're going to do it as the after party for Startup Community Awards. And so you'll get a two for one.
Amazing. Are you nominated for anything?
Oh yeah, I did get nominated. I'm not sure for what, but I got nominated for something, and I'll be communicating that. You can
Best
vote for
hoodie.
me. Best hoodie, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
A great episode. Anything else, guys? Anything else top of mind?
I missed you guys. Glad we're doing this again.
I'm really happy, Eleonore, that you're back, and hopefully we can get on a good schedule. I think it was a really good episode. I think we'll wrap here, and thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to TechPoutine. If you like the show, please subscribe or leave a review.